Rejected by her family for saying no to the match, a lone cowboy welcomed her into his heart. The wagon lurched to a stop at the edge of town, and Margaret's father shoved her trunk onto the dusty ground without meeting her eyes. Her mother's face remained stone cold through the window as the driver cracked the whip. Margaret stood alone on the empty road, watching the only family she had ever known disappear into the distance. The rejection stung worse than any physical blow, all because she had refused to marry Henry Crawford, the banker's son with wandering hands and a cruel smile. Her bags contained everything she owned, which wasn't much. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she picked up her belongings and started walking toward town. She had $17 to her name and nowhere to go. The main street of Redemption Creek was quiet except for the sound of hammering coming from somewhere nearby. Margaret's arms ached from carrying her trunk, and sweat trickled down her back. She passed the general store, the saloon, and the sheriff's office before spotting a small boarding house with a vacancy sign. The proprietor, a thin woman with suspicious eyes, quoted her a price that would drain her funds in less than 2 weeks. Margaret thanked her and left, feeling panic rise in her chest. She sat on a bench outside the post office and tried to think clearly. She needed work, and she needed it fast. A cowboy rode past on a paint horse, tipping his hat politely. He had kind eyes and a weather-beaten face that spoke of long days under the sun. Margaret watched him tie his horse outside the general store and disappear inside. She had never spoken to a cowboy before. Her family had considered them beneath their station, rough men who lived without proper society. But her family had also thrown her away like garbage, so maybe their opinions weren't worth much anymore. The cowboy emerged carrying supplies and noticed her sitting there with her trunk. He approached slowly, as if she were a spooked animal. His name was Jack Murphy, and he owned a small ranch about 5 miles outside town. He had come in for supplies and noticed she looked lost. Margaret explained her situation carefully, leaving out the shameful details. She needed work and a place to stay. Jack listened without interrupting, his blue eyes serious and thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he offered her a job. His ranch hand's wife had passed away 6 months ago, and the house needed someone to keep it clean and cook meals. The pay wasn't much, but room and board were included. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but forced them back. She accepted immediately, and Jack loaded her trunk onto his supply wagon. They rode in comfortable silence as the town disappeared behind them. The landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with cattle and scrub brush. Jack's ranch was modest but well-maintained. The house was small but sturdy, with a covered porch and flower beds that had gone to weeds. He showed her to a clean room with a real bed and told her to rest. They would discuss details in the morning. That night, Margaret lay in bed and stared at the ceiling.
She had never been on her own before. Part of her felt terrified, but another part felt something she hadn't expected.
Relief. The rooster's crow woke Margaret before dawn. She dressed quickly and found Jack already outside, feeding horses in the early morning light. He turned when he heard her footsteps and smiled slightly. Most folks slept late their first day, he said, but he appreciated her eagerness. He showed her around the property while explaining the routine. 3 ranch hands worked for him, living in the bunkhouse across the yard. Their names were Pete, Carlos, and young Ben, who couldn't have been more than 19. They would expect breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, and supper at 7. Jack's expectations were simple. Keep the house clean, prepare the meals, and tend the vegetable garden behind the barn. In return, she would have her room, 3 meals a day, and $20 a month. Margaret threw herself into the work with fierce determination. She scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed, beat the dust from every rug, and washed windows that probably hadn't been cleaned in years. The vegetable garden was a disaster of weeds and neglect, but she spent hours on her knees pulling them out and discovering struggling tomato plants and bean vines underneath. Cooking for 4 men was different from the fancy meals her mother had prepared for dinner parties. The men wanted simple, hearty food. Biscuits and gravy. Beans and cornbread first. Stew with lots of meat. She learned quickly by trial and error. Her first batch of biscuits came out hard as rocks, and Pete joked that they could use them as ammunition. But by the end of the first week, she was producing meals that cleaned every plate. Jack was different from any man she had known. He spoke little but noticed everything. When he saw her struggling to carry water from the well, he rigged up a pulley system without being asked. When her hands became raw from washing, he left a tin of salve on the kitchen table with no explanation. He never invaded her space or made her uncomfortable. Sometimes she caught him watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't desire exactly, more like appreciation mixed with curiosity. She wondered what he thought of her, this city girl who had been thrown away by her own family. The ranch hands accepted her presence with varying degrees of warmth. Pete was gruff but harmless, a man in his 50s who had worked cattle his whole life. Carlos was quiet and polite, sending money back to his family in Mexico every month. Young Ben developed an obvious crush that made him stumble over his words whenever she spoke to him. She treated them all with the same professional courtesy, and they responded by being respectful in return. It was a different world from the one she had known. Simpler. Harder. But somehow more honest. 3 weeks passed in a blur of routine. Margaret fell into bed exhausted every night and woke before dawn to start again. Her hands developed calluses. Her skin darkened despite her bonnet. She grew stronger, both physically and mentally. The shame of her rejection began to fade, replaced by pride in her accomplishments. She could make a perfect pot of coffee now. She could kill and pluck a chicken without flinching. She could grow things from the earth and turn them into meals. These weren't the skills her mother had tried to teach her, but they felt more valuable somehow. One evening after supper, Jack asked if she would walk with him. They strolled past the barn toward a small creek that ran through his property. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Jack told her about his life, speaking more than she had ever heard him speak before. He had built this ranch from nothing with his own 2 hands. He had been married once, briefly, but his wife had died of fever their first winter together. That was 7 years ago. He had thrown himself into work to forget the pain, building his herd and his land into something he could be proud of. But lately he had begun to feel the loneliness more acutely. The empty house. The silent evenings. The absence of someone to share his life with. Margaret listened and felt her heart beat faster. She knew where this conversation was heading, and she didn't know how she felt about it. Jack stopped walking and turned to face her directly. He wasn't a man for pretty words or flowery speeches. He said plainly that he had grown fond of her. He respected her work ethic and her strength. He enjoyed her company. If she was willing, he would like to court her properly. Not because he needed a housekeeper, he added quickly. He could hire one of those, but because he genuinely cared for her and wanted to know her better. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes for the second time since arriving at the ranch. But these were different tears. She told him yes. She would like that very much. Their courtship was nothing like the formal affairs she had known back home. There were no chaperoned parlor visits or elaborate dances. Instead, Jack taught her to ride horses. They explored his land together, and he showed her every corner of his property with obvious pride. They sat on the porch after supper and talked about everything and nothing. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard. He learned that she could be surprisingly stubborn when she believed in something. They discovered they both loved reading, though their taste in books was completely different. He preferred adventure stories while she enjoyed poetry. They argued good-naturedly about which was better. The ranch hands noticed the change and teased Jack mercilessly when Margaret wasn't around. Pete told him it was about time he stopped moping. Carlos said she was too good for him, and he better not mess it up. Ben looked heartbroken for about a week before bouncing back with his usual enthusiasm. Life continued with its daily rhythms. The cattle needed tending. The fences needed mending. The garden needed watering. But now there was something else woven through it all. Something warm and hopeful that made even the hard days feel lighter. Margaret's mother would have been horrified. A cowboy. A man who worked with his hands and smelled of horses and leather. A man with no social standing or family connections. But as Margaret sat beside Jack on the porch one evening, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast sky, she realized she had never been happier. Her family had rejected her for refusing to marry a man she didn't love. In doing so, they had accidentally freed her to find a man she could love. She reached over and took Jack's calloused hand in hers. He squeezed gently and smiled. 2 months after Margaret arrived at the ranch, a letter came. Her younger sister had managed to sneak it past their parents. The situation back home had grown tense. Henry Crawford had been furious about Margaret's refusal and had spread ugly rumors about her character. Her family had believed him, or pretended to, because admitting the truth would damage their social standing. Her sister wrote that she missed Margaret terribly and hoped she was safe wherever she had gone. Margaret read the letter twice and then burned it in the stove. That life was over. This was her life now, and she had chosen it freely. Jack found her standing by the stove with tears running down her face. He didn't ask questions, just pulled her into his arms and let her cry. When she finally composed herself, she told him everything. About Henry Crawford's advances, about her parents' insistence that she marry him despite her protests, about being thrown out of the only home she had ever known because she had dared to say no. Jack's jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. He said her family were fools who didn't deserve her. He said she was the bravest person he had ever met. He said he would never let anyone hurt her again. Margaret believed him. The seasons changed. Fall arrived with cooler temperatures and the annual cattle drive. Jack planned to take his herd to market, a 3-week journey that would require all hands. He hesitated about leaving Margaret alone at the ranch, but she insisted she would be fine. She had become comfortable with solitude and capable in ways she never imagined possible. Besides, the neighboring ranch was only 2 miles away if she needed help. Jack left detailed instructions and enough supplies to last a month. Pete promised to check on her when they passed back through. Then they were gone, and Margaret stood alone watching the dust cloud fade into the distance. The first week passed peacefully. Margaret kept herself busy with projects she had been putting off. She reorganized the pantry. She sewed new curtains for the kitchen. She harvested the last of the garden vegetables and started canning them for winter. The nights were the hardest. The house felt too big and too quiet. She missed Jack's presence more than she expected. They had only been courting for 2 months, but he had become such a constant in her life that his absence left a noticeable hole. She told herself not to be foolish. He would return soon enough. The trouble started on the 8th day. Margaret was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching. 3 men rode into the yard, and she recognized none of them. They dismounted without being invited and walked toward her with predatory confidence. The leader was a tall man with a scarred face and cruel eyes. He asked where the owner was. Margaret said he was away on business. The man smiled unpleasantly. That was convenient, he said. They had heard this ranch was doing well. Might be willing to sell if the price was right. Margaret said the ranch wasn't for sale. The man's smile widened. Everything was for sale at the right price. Margaret's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. She asked them to leave. The scarred man laughed and said they would leave when they were ready. They wanted to look around first. See what kind of operation Jack Murphy was running. Margaret knew she should be afraid, and part of her was, but a larger part was angry. Furious, actually. These men thought they could intimidate her because she was a woman alone. They thought she was helpless. Her hand inched toward the rifle Jack kept loaded by the door. The scarred man noticed, and his expression darkened. He advised her not to do anything stupid. Margaret grabbed the rifle in one smooth motion and pointed it directly at his chest. Her hands were steady even though her pulse raced. She told them they had 3 seconds to get on their horses and leave. The men looked surprised, then amused. The scarred man said she probably didn't even know how to use that thing. Margaret cocked the rifle with a sharp click. She said she knew exactly how to use it, and if they doubted her, they were welcome to find out. Something in her tone made them reconsider. The scarred man raised his hands in mock surrender. They didn't want any trouble, just wanted to look around. But they would leave since she insisted. The 3 men mounted their horses slowly, making a show of their departure. The scarred man paused at the edge of the yard and looked back at Margaret. He said Jack Murphy had made an enemy of the wrong people. This ranch would be theirs one way or another. Then they rode off, leaving Margaret standing alone with the rifle still clutched in her shaking hands. She watched until they disappeared completely before allowing herself to collapse onto the porch steps. The anger drained away, leaving only fear in its wake. She needed to warn Jack, but she had no way to reach him on the trail. Margaret spent the rest of the day preparing. She loaded every gun on the property and positioned them strategically around the house. She checked the locks on all the doors and windows. She moved valuable items into her room where she could defend them if necessary. When night fell, she barely slept. Every sound outside made her reach for the pistol under her pillow. She told herself she was being paranoid. The men probably wouldn't come back, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they would, and when they did, she would be ready. The attack came 2 nights later, just before dawn. Margaret woke to the sound of breaking glass. She grabbed the pistol and ran to the window in time to see flames licking up the side of the barn. The 3 men from before were in the yard, and they had brought reinforcements. 6 men total, all armed and clearly intending to burn Jack's ranch to the ground. Margaret didn't hesitate. She fired a shot through the window that sent them scattering for cover. Then she grabbed the rifle and took up position in the kitchen where she had a clear view of the yard. The men returned fire, bullets thudding into the wooden walls. Margaret dropped to the floor and crawled to a different window. She fired twice more, not trying to hit them but to keep them pinned down. The barn was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the sky. She felt sick watching it burn but couldn't focus on that. She had to protect the house. One of the men tried to circle around back. Margaret anticipated the move and met him with a shotgun blast that blew out his knee. His screams filled the air as he fell writhing to the ground. The other men hesitated, clearly not expecting this level of resistance. Margaret heard them shouting to each other, arguing about what to do. She reloaded quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Jack had taught her well. She knew these guns. She knew this house. She had the advantage of position and determination, but she was still one person against 5 armed men. She couldn't hold them off forever. Where were the neighbors? Surely someone had seen the smoke. She fired again, shattering a window in the bunkhouse where 2 men had taken cover. The standoff continued as dawn broke fully. The barn had collapsed into smoldering ruins. The smoke hung thick in the air, making Margaret's eyes water. She was running low on ammunition. Her ears rang from the gunfire. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, but she refused to surrender. These men would take Jack's ranch over her dead body. She heard more horses approaching and felt her stomach drop. Reinforcements. They'd brought even more men. She was finished. But the new arrivals weren't with the attackers. Jack came charging into the yard on his paint horse, followed by Pete, Carlos, and Ben. They must have pushed hard through the night when they saw the smoke. Jack's face was a mask of fury as he took in the burning barn and the bullet-riddled house. The attackers tried to flee, but Jack and his men cut them off. The scarred leader made a desperate attempt to shoot Jack. Margaret fired first. Her bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Jack was on him in seconds, dragging him from his horse and throwing him to the ground. The fight was over in minutes. The remaining attackers were surrounded and disarmed. Jack left Pete and Carlos to guard them while he ran to the house. He burst through the door, calling Margaret's name. She emerged from the kitchen, soot-stained and exhausted, but unhurt. Jack pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. She felt him shaking and realized he was terrified at how close he had come to losing her. She held him back just as tightly and told him she was okay. The house was okay. She had protected it. She had protected his ranch. Jack pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. He said she was insane. She could have been killed. She should have run to the neighbors. Margaret said there hadn't been time, and besides, she wasn't about to let anyone take what belonged to them. Jack stared at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her. Not the chaste kiss of their courtship, but something deeper and more urgent, a promise and a claim all at once. When they finally broke apart, Margaret said she loved him. Jack said he loved her too. Then he said he was a fool for leaving her alone. She said he couldn't have known. He said from now on they faced everything together. The sheriff arrived with his deputies an hour later. The attackers were arrested and hauled back to town. The scarred man nursing his wounded shoulder claimed they were just trying to make Jack an offer. Margaret's bullet hole in his shoulder in the burned barn told a different story. The sheriff said there would be a trial, and they would need Margaret to testify. She agreed without hesitation. She had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. She had defended her home, and she would stand up in court and say so. The ranch hands spent the next week cleaning up the damage. The barn was a total loss, but insurance would cover most of the rebuilding. The house needed repairs, but was structurally sound. Margaret worked alongside the men, clearing debris and salvaging what could be saved. She refused to let Jack coddle her or treat her like she was fragile. She had proven she was neither fragile nor helpless. She was a rancher's woman now, and she would act like it. Word of the attack spread through the territory. Margaret became something of a local legend. The city girl who held off 6 armed men with nothing but rifles and determination. Women in town asked her how she had found the courage. Margaret said it wasn't courage. It was stubbornness. She had been rejected by her family, thrown away like she was nothing. She had built a new life from scratch through hard work and sheer will. She would be damned if she let anyone take that away from her. The women nodded in understanding. More than a few of them had similar stories of their own. Jack's feelings for Margaret deepened into something unshakable. I would be so happy he had left his ranch in her hands, and she had defended it like a lioness protecting her den. She had faced down armed men without flinching. She had saved everything he had worked for, but more than that, she had proven she was his equal in every way that mattered. She was strong. She was brave. She was loyal. She was his partner, not just his housekeeper or his potential wife. She was someone he could build a life with, someone he could trust completely. 3 weeks after the attack, Jack proposed properly. He took Margaret back to the creek where they had first talked about courtship. The sunset painted the sky in those same shades of orange and purple. He knelt in the grass and pulled out a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. He said Margaret had already proven she was willing to fight for this ranch and for him. He would spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of her. Would she marry him? Margaret didn't hesitate. She said yes with tears streaming down her face. Happy tears this time. Jack slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her again while the water burbled past and the first stars emerged overhead. They married a month later in a simple ceremony at the church in town. Margaret wore a dress borrowed from the neighbor's wife. Jack wore his best suit, which he admitted he hadn't worn since his first wedding. Pete, Carlos, and Ben attended, along with most of the town. Margaret's family was not invited and did not come. She felt a pang of sadness that her sister couldn't be there, but only a pang. These people surrounding them now were her real family. The people who had accepted her without question. The people who respected her strength instead of punishing her for it. The reception was held at the ranch. The new barn was only half rebuilt, but no one cared. Long tables were set up in the yard, loaded with food that the town's women had prepared. There was music and dancing. Pete got drunk and told embarrassing stories about Jack from their younger days. Carlos proposed a toast in Spanish that no one understood, but everyone cheered for anyway. Ben presented them with a hand-carved wooden sign for the ranch gate with both their names on it. Margaret cried again, overwhelmed by the generosity and acceptance. As the sun set and the party wound down, Jack and Margaret escaped to the house. Their house now. She was no longer just the housekeeper or the woman who held off attackers. She was Margaret Murphy, rancher's wife and full partner in this enterprise. They stood on the porch together, Jack's arm around her waist, and looked out at the land that stretched before them. It needed work. The barn still needed finishing. The fences needed replacing in several sections. The cattle herd could be bigger, but they would build it together one day at a time. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here, the rejection that had felt like the end of the world. The fear and uncertainty of being cast out alone, the desperate search for any kind of work. If her parents could see her now, they probably wouldn't recognize her. The soft city girl was gone, replaced by someone harder and stronger. Someone with calloused hands and sun-darkened skin. Someone who could shoot straight and wasn't afraid of hard work. Someone who had found love not in a socially acceptable match arranged by her parents, but in a partnership forged through mutual respect and shared struggle. Jack looked down at her and smiled. He said he couldn't believe his luck. Margaret laughed and said luck had nothing to do with it. She had chosen him just as much as he had chosen her. They had both been lonely people finding each other at exactly the right moment. Jack said he would thank her family for being stupid enough to throw her out, except that would require speaking to them, which he had no interest in doing. Margaret agreed wholeheartedly. Some bridges were better left burned. Winter arrived in earnest, bringing cold winds and occasional snow. Margaret and Jack spent the long evenings by the fire, reading together or just sitting in comfortable silence. She taught him to appreciate poetry, though he claimed it was nonsense half the time. He taught her to play chess, though she beat him more often than not. They planned for spring. More cattle to buy. Seeds to plant. Improvements to make. They argued occasionally about the best way to do things, but the arguments never lasted. They were both too practical and too aware of how much they needed each other. The trial of the men who attacked the ranch took place in early February. Margaret testified clearly and without emotion, describing exactly what had happened. The defense attorney tried to suggest she had overreacted, that the men had meant no real harm. Margaret looked him in the eye and asked if he would consider having his barn burned down and his home shot full of holes to be no real harm. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding all 6 men guilty. The scarred leader received 10 years in prison. The others received lesser sentences. Justice, Margaret thought, had been served. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The rebuilt barn stood tall and proud. The garden flourished under Margaret's care. The cattle herd had increased by 30 head. Jack hired another hand to help with the extra work, a young man named Samuel who was quiet but capable. Margaret treated him the same way she treated all the hands, with professional respect and hearty meals. She had found her rhythm here. She knew who she was and what she was capable of. She had stopped wondering what her old life might have been like if she had made different choices. One morning in late April, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but hadn't been sure. Now there was no doubt, she told Jack that evening after supper. He was speechless for a full minute, his face cycling through shock, joy, and terror in rapid succession. Then he started laughing, picked her up, and spun her around despite her protests.
A baby. They were going to have a big...
Margaret laughed with him, caught up in his enthusiasm. It felt right. It felt like the final piece of their life falling into place. The pregnancy was relatively easy. Margaret continued working, though Jack fussed over her constantly. The ranch hands treated her like she was made of glass, much to her annoyance. She insisted she was perfectly capable of doing her job. Jack finally put his foot down when he caught her trying to move furniture by herself. From now on, he said, the heavy work was off limits. She could cook and garden and manage the household, but nothing that required serious lifting. Margaret argued but secretly appreciated his concern. She had grown up without much affection from her parents. Jack's protectiveness was something new and precious. Summer heat made the final months of pregnancy uncomfortable, but Margaret endured. The baby was active, kicking constantly, Jack would put his hand on her belly and feel the movements with an expression of wonder. He talked to the baby, telling it about the ranch and the life they would have together. Margaret teased him about getting soft. Jack said he wasn't soft, just realistic. This baby would need to learn about ranching from day one. Margaret said the baby needed to learn to walk first. Jack said details. In late August, Margaret went into labor. Jack panicked, despite all their preparations. He rode like mad to fetch the doctor from town, leaving Pete to sit with Margaret and try to keep her calm. The labor was long and difficult. 18 hours of pain that left Margaret exhausted and Jack a nervous wreck outside the door. But when the doctor finally emerged holding a healthy baby girl, all the pain was forgotten. Margaret held her daughter and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. Jack cried, unabashedly, touching the baby's tiny fingers with shaking hands. They named her Catherine, after Jack's mother. She had dark hair and blue eyes like her father, and from the beginning she was strong and willful like her mother. The ranch hands all came by to see the baby, offering awkward congratulations and handmade gifts. Pete had carved a wooden rattle. Carlos brought a blanket his wife had made. Ben looked terrified of the tiny baby, but managed to hold her for approximately 30 seconds before handing her back. Samuel gave them a silver dollar for luck. Margaret was touched by their kindness. The first few months were exhausting. Catherine didn't sleep much, which meant Margaret and Jack didn't sleep much either. They took turns walking the floor with her at night. Margaret learned to cook one-handed while holding the baby. Jack learned to change diapers, though he complained about it constantly. Life became a blur of feedings and crying and precious moments when Catherine actually slept, but neither of them would have traded it for anything. This was their family. This was what they had built together. By the time Catherine was 6 months old, a routine had been established. Margaret could manage the household and the baby simultaneously, though it required careful planning and more energy than she had thought she possessed. Jack helped whenever he wasn't working, which endeared him to her even more. Many men considered child-rearing to be women's work and refused to participate. Jack had no such prejudices. This was his daughter, and he would do whatever was necessary to care for her. A letter arrived in October. Margaret's sister had somehow discovered her address. The letter was several pages long, filled with news from home. Their mother had suffered a stroke and was partially paralyzed. Their father had lost a significant amount of money in a bad business deal. Henry Crawford had married someone else, a young woman from a wealthy family who apparently made his life miserable. Her sister wrote that their parents had spoken of Margaret recently, expressing regret for how they had treated her. They wanted to know if she would be willing to visit. Her sister hoped Margaret had found happiness wherever she had gone. Margaret read the letter twice and then showed it to Jack. He asked what she wanted to do. Margaret considered carefully. Part of her wanted to refuse. Her parents had thrown her away when she needed them most. They had chosen social appearances over their own daughter's well-being. They didn't deserve forgiveness. But another part of her, the part that remembered good times from her childhood, felt sympathy. Her mother was sick. Her father was struggling. And her sister, innocent in all of this, clearly wanted the family reconciled. Margaret decided she would write back. She would tell her sister about her life, about Jack and the ranch, and Catherine. But she would not visit. Not yet. Maybe someday. But not yet. Jack supported her decision completely. He said it was her family and her choice. He would stand by her whatever she decided. Margaret appreciated his understanding more than she could express. She wrote a long letter to her sister, including a photograph of the three of them taken by the traveling photographer who had passed through town. In the photograph, Margaret stood beside Jack, holding Catherine. They looked like what they were, a strong family built on love and mutual respect. She wondered what her parents would think when they saw it. Probably shocked that their refined daughter had married a cowboy. But Margaret didn't care anymore what they thought. Winter came again, and Catherine celebrated her first birthday. The ranch had prospered under Jack and Margaret's joint management. They now had the second largest herd in the county. The house had been expanded with an additional room for Catherine and space for future children. Margaret had proven herself as both a rancher's wife and a business partner. She kept the books and managed the finances while Jack handled the daily operations. They made decisions together, pooling their different strengths. It was a true partnership in every sense. One evening in late January, they sat on the porch despite the cold. Catherine was asleep inside, and they had stolen a few moments of peace. Margaret thought about how far she had come in the 2 years since her family had rejected her. From terrified and alone to strong and certain. From dependent and sheltered to capable and independent. From rejected daughter to beloved wife and mother. She looked at Jack and thanked him for taking a chance on her. Jack said he should be thanking her. She had taken his empty house and lonely life and filled it with purpose and joy. They had saved each other, really. Margaret agreed. They had both been broken in different ways. Jack by loss and loneliness.
Margaret by rejection and betrayal.
But they had found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful together. This ranch. This family. This life. It wasn't the life Margaret had been raised to expect. It was better, more real, more honest, more hers. She had been rejected by her family for saying no to a match she didn't want. That rejection had led her to a lone cowboy who welcomed her into his heart. And together they had created something worth fighting for, something worth defending, something worth celebrating. The stars emerged overhead, bright and cold in the winter sky. Inside the house, Catherine stirred and made soft baby noises before settling back to sleep. The cattle lowed softly in the distance. The wind whispered through the bare trees. Jack took Margaret's hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found home in each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new work. But tonight, they were simply together, and that was enough. It would always be enough.